British Columbia, Canada, June 16th, 1811. Aboard the American fur ship known as the Tonquin, fur trader James Lewis lies below deck, mortally wounded. His breathing is labored, and he strains to listen to the native warriors that are just now pulling their long dugout canoes up next to the hulking vessel. He does not know their language, and thus he does not know what they are saying. But he knows why they are here. And James Lewis knows what is about to happen. The chilly waters that surround the vessel situated in Tla-o-qui-aht Sound were seemingly empty just minutes ago. Now they seem to swarm with war canoes, dozens of them, filled with angered clerical warriors. Soon, the plodding of moccasin footsteps begins to cause a low rumble, as if a thunderstorm is brewing somewhere far away. Lewis begins to feel sick, the noxious effects of his physical state and his psychological distress. But his resolve remains steady. His gaze drops momentarily, and he stares blankly into the room full of gunpowder kegs, outside of which he lies, propped up against one of the sturdy wooden walls of the ship. He again studies the line of dark powder stretching from his position into the room. He is tired. The night before had been the longest of his still young life, in which his thoughts had drifted from his current situation to his family and friends at home, whom he knows he will never see again. He had also had much time to ponder the events of the previous few days, and just how he had come to be here, alone, below decks of this expensive and well-traveled ship. Lewis had been part of a crew of American, French, Canadian, and native fur traders under the employ of the legendary business and real estate mogul, John Jacob Astor. They had traveled to this distant locale in the hopes of trading with the natives for the valuable beaver pelts that were, at this time in the 19th century, a highly profitable commodity. For the next few days, they had anchored offshore of these idyllic lands and bartered a number of profitable trades with the locals. Though the men on board the Tonquin and the local coyote had respective origins thousands of miles away from each other, they were well aware of each other's existence. Though America as a nation extends only to the Mississippi River, at this point in the early 19th century, the American fur trade is a globalized industry. The fashionable beaver pelt stovepipe hat at this time is all the rage in Europe as well as the more cosmopolitan urban centers in America. Cafes, parlors, and street corners are all replete with young men sporting their most stylish new headgear. In what might be considered both the height of irony and a wonder of a worldwide supply chain, it is the fashionable fancies of the European upper classes that drive the day-to-day lives and livelihoods of people more than half a world away. Throughout the entirety of North America, fur trappers roam the rivers and streams, hoping to ensnare the valuable animals in their steel traps and send their bounties out to market by way of St. Louis or Santa Fe. And on the open seas, American vessels routinely made the treacherous journey around Cape Horn and up the west coast of North America to the Pacific Northwest, where they traded for furs with local natives. Within a few decades' time, the entire system would implode, as changing fashions and waning beaver populations would prove too much for the market to bear. However, in 1811, there is scarcely a more profitable trade on the whole of the continent, and men are driven to great lengths in their quests to build their fortunes. Perhaps most prominent among these men, capitalizing on the fur boom, is Johann Jakob Astor, better known as John Jacob Astor, a German-born American immigrant who had capitalized on the Jay Treaty that was signed by the United States and Great Britain in 1794. The treaty opened new markets in the Great Lakes region as well as in Canada. Astor signed a contract with a Northwest company based in Montreal. Astor would import the furs from Montreal to New York and then ship them to Europe to be purchased by hat manufacturers. By the turn of the 19th century, He had amassed a fortune of roughly $250,000, over $6 million by today's standards, when accounting for inflation. However, in 1807, the U.S. Embargo Act was enacted by Congress, closing off trade with Canada and severely disrupting Astor's business dealings, as his connections in Montreal were now illegal. In response, Astor obtained direct permission from President Thomas Jefferson to establish the American Fur Company, which he did in 1808. Over the next few years, Astor would use the American Fur Company, or AFC, as well as its subsidiaries, to gain control of virtually the entirety of the Great Lakes region, as well as secure several lucrative contracts. Intending to hamper his former employer in the Northwest Company, as well as the juggernaut of the industry in the Hudson's Bay Company, Astor soon began to finance expeditions to the Pacific Northwest in hopes of monopolizing the fur trade with the natives there before his rivals could gain a foothold. This had been the driving force behind Astor's purchase of the Tonquin. In 1810, Astor created the Pacific Fur Company, a subsidiary of the American Fur Company, to expand into the Northwest with intentions to both explore the territory and to establish favorable relations with the natives. Astor had purchased the Tonquin, a 290-pound bark, 96 feet in length, and outfitted to carry 22 cannons, from the Fanning and Coles Company, who had sailed the ship to China to trade for cheap goods in 1807. Astor purchased the vessel for $37,860, roughly $700,000 today, on August 23, 1810. He hired the most experienced fur traders he knew, mostly Scottish and French-Canadian voyageurs who had long plied their arduous trades amongst the natives of the Great Lakes region. And to command the ship, Astor sought out the services of a short-tempered and staunchly disciplined ex-U.S. Navy captain named Jonathan Thorn, born in Schenectady, New York, on January 8, 1779. He was the first of 15 children born to Samuel and Helena Horn. He became a midshipman in the U.S. Navy at age 21 in April of 1800. Thorn participated in the Tripolitan War, also known as the First Barbary War. In 1801, Thorn was part of a small group of volunteers that accomplished the dangerous mission of sneaking into the harbor at Tripoli, Libya, and destroying the captured American frigate known as the Philadelphia on February 16, 1804. On August 3 of that same year, Thorn also participated in the attack on Tripoli harbor, led by Commodore Edward Preble. He was commended for his conduct during the engagement and was given command of one of the captured gunboats. While serving in the New York Navy Yard, he was promoted to the rank of full lieutenant in February 1807. At the time, Thorn was the youngest naval officer to ever command a United States naval yard. Still, despite his relatively rapid ascension within the ranks of the Navy, Thorn's correspondence to friends and family at the time betray a young man internally besieged by self-doubt and various physical ailments. Thorn would serve in the Navy until 1810, when he was granted a 2-year furlough in order to sign on with John Jacob Astor for a job as captain of the Tonquin. But as much as Astor's thought processes were logical, he would simply hire the best, most experienced men he could for each position. They lacked in overall accounting for the variability of human temperaments, perspectives, and experiences. And unfortunately for the men embarking on the Tonquin, there were scarcely two cultures more at odds than that of Captain Thorn's disciplined navy and that of the purely pragmatic, often romanticized voyageurs. The Tonquin set sail from New York City on September 8, 1810, carrying a crew of 34 men. They rounded Cape Horn and stopped off in Hawaii before arriving at the mouth of the Columbia River on the 22nd of March, 1811. During the entirety of the journey, Captain Thorn had proven increasingly at odds with the voyageurs. They found him wildly overbearing, while he found them slothful and disorganized. Thorn saw his obedience to the orders of Astor as his primary responsibility, while the voyageurs viewed themselves as skilled and knowledgeable tradesmen who had hired on for a job they intended to do well. However, they had no intentions nor inclinations to adhere to what they saw as the captain's overly strict policies and timelines. En route to the Pacific Northwest, Thorn's adherence to schedule was tested beyond what he considered to be reasonable bounds. On December 4, 1810, when the Tonquin had pulled into Port Egmont and the Falkland Islands in order to gather supplies and make minor repairs, 8 men had ventured into the interior of the islands in hopes of procuring more provisions. When they proved slightly tardy on their return, Thorn saw fit to sail away with the remainder of the crew and leave the 8 men stranded on the remote island. Desperate, and with little other option, the 8 men struck out desperately in their rowboat in hopes of catching up with the Tonquin. After 6 exhausting hours, the men in the rowboat managed to come within sight of the Tonquin. One of the crewmen, a man named Robert Stewart, threatened to kill the captain should he not turn around to rescue the men in the rowboat. Thorn, rightfully taking the threat quite seriously, obliged to Stewart in his cohort's demands, and the 8 crewmen were subsequently rescued. While Thorn had seen the action as a necessary imposition of discipline, the trappers and crewmen, who were not military men, saw it as a dishonorable and wholly condemnable action. Thorn, for his part, had become increasingly frustrated with the laissez-faire attitude of the fur traders. He found the jovial atmosphere they created as inappropriate, dismissive, and even dangerous. By the time the Tonquin sailed into the waters of Hawaii's Kalakua Bay on the 12th of February, 1811, the crew and the captain were seemingly irreparably at odds. Though he was a stalwart disciplinarian, Thorn did see the necessity in maintaining at least some semblance of cordiality between himself and the crew. So while in Hawaii, Thorn finally made a temporary peace between himself and the senior partner fur traders. Thorn recruited 24 Hawaiian Kanaka laborers to assist in the day-to-day work that awaited the crew of the Tonquin upon their arrival in the Pacific Northwest. The Tonquin left Hawaii behind on March 1st, 1811. 3 weeks later, on March 22nd, 1811, the ship came into sight of its most formidable challenge yet, the Columbia River. Among the tasks that Thorn had been charged with by Astor was the building of a permanent trading post near the critical geographical point where the Columbia River pours into the Pacific Ocean. Even today, the swirling, raging waters of the area provide a daunting task for sailors in modern-day vessels to navigate. But Thorn was unmoved by the fearful sight of the violent, churning waters. His concern was only the task at hand. Thus, on a particularly stormy day, he ordered 5 men to cast out in a rowboat and make their way into the middle of the waters to sound the bottom or determine the depth of the water so that the larger ship could find a spot on the formidable sandbar deep enough for it to get through. The terrified men beseeched Thorn with heartfelt pleas for their lives, as they saw venturing into the turbulent waters before them as tantamount to suicide. J.C. Fox, a veteran Boston sailor and Thorn's first mate, was appointed to lead the task. He was ordered to take a crew composed of 3 French Canadians who had never been to sea before, and an aging Yankee sailor who would be of marginal use at the oars. He protested vociferously to the captain, who only dismissed the terrified young man by turning his back to him and remarking that if he was so afraid of water, he should have stayed in Boston. Thorn ordered them to carry on, insisting that he needed all of his experienced sailors to man the ship in the midst of the repressive squall they were currently enduring. Ultimately, Fox mournfully obliged. He sorrowfully addressed his comrades, saying that his uncle had left his bones at the bottom of this channel only a year before, trying to make the treacherous crossing himself, and that now he would join. It would be only minutes later when the boat would capsize amidst the waves, killing all 5 men on board. 3 days later, on the 25th of March, 1811, another crew of 5 men was ordered to repeat the same mission that had killed their unfortunate comrades scarcely 48 hours earlier. Their small rowboat met the same fate, being capsized in short order amidst the crashing waters. However, this time, one American crew member and one of the Hawaiian Kanakas managed to miraculously make their way to shore after a horrifically harrowing ordeal that saw both nearly succumb to drowning and then hypothermia. The next day, the Tonquin was able to navigate past the sandbar, laying anchor in Baker Bay. Thorne and the remaining members of the crew then came ashore. Over the succeeding few weeks, the crew of the voyageurs and the remaining Hawaiians would construct a trading post. This post would blossom into an economic hub and is today the town of Astoria, Oregon. As they labored, much of the conversation amongst the men was conducted amongst themselves and their native tongues, so as to be indiscernible to Captain Thorne. But it was clear to the captain, from their tone alone, that the crew were nearing a mutinous fervor. Still, the mission carried on. As the months passed, trade was carried out with curious locals, such as the Tla-o-qui-aht people, a Chinookan tribe that had been encountered by the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1805. Thorne pressed the Tla-o-qui-aht for information on any of their neighbors to the north, who might be open to trading as well. He was referred to the Tla-o-qui-aht tribe, who resided around the Tla-o-qui-aht Bay, some 430 miles to the north. The Tla-o-qui-aht, meaning the people from Tla-o-qui or Tla-o-qui, had recently engaged in peaceable trading with a number of European merchants. They were a hunter-gathering people, descendants of the Nunchanos. Scant years before, in the late 1700s, they had engaged in prolonged and vicious intertribal warfare in efforts to rid their territories of foreign invaders from rival nations. Thorne was encouraged by the potential profit source and dismissive of any military threat that might be posed against his superiorly armed men aboard their state-of-the-art ship. And so, on June 5, 1811, the Tonquin again crossed the sandbar, leaving the waters of the bay and heading north, again towards current-day Vancouver, British Columbia. As they traveled north, they stopped intermittently to come ashore and trade with other tribes along the way. During one of these stops, they hired a local native named Tla-o-qui-aht to serve as their interpreter as they continued on northward. Thorne was again cautioned against venturing into the Tla-o-qui-aht's territory, as they had recently had some tense dealings with other European traders. Thorne, again, dismissed any threat posed by the natives paddling cedar canoes and wielding homemade war clubs against his mighty and well-armed vessel. During the second week of June, the Tonquin finally made its way into the waters of Tla-o-qui-aht Sound. Alexander Mackay, the most experienced Scottish fur trader on board the ship, and Tla-o-qui-aht went ashore to establish relations with the Tla-o-qui-aht. They were received peaceably, even being welcome to stay the night in the chief's longhouse. The next day, as Mackay and Tla-o-qui-aht established trade on shore, a number of Tla-o-qui-aht canoes went out to the Tonquin in hopes of bartering for more goods than Mackay and Tla-o-qui-aht had brought with them. Before leaving to come ashore, Mackay had cautioned Captain Thorne of this eventuality, and warned him not to let too many Tla-o-qui-aht on board at once. Thorne, wholly inexperienced in trading with natives, save for his most recent dealings in the past few weeks, brushed Mackay's concerns aside, again reassuring him that the Tonquins might render it practically invincible to native attack. As curious Tla-o-qui-aht clambered on board, Thorne ordered several blankets spread out on deck and trade goods laid upon them. Believing himself a shrewd bargainer, Thorne attempted engaging a Tla-o-qui-aht elder, a chief known as Newcomie in trade. He offered 2 blankets, an assortment of beads, and a number of metal fishhooks in exchange for 1 otter pelt, an offer he felt to be more than charitable. Newcombe, however, was an experienced and shrewd deal-maker, a veteran of countless dealings with Europeans and other natives throughout his long life. He rejected Thorne's offer, outright, scornfully condemning it as egregiously low. Newcombe insisted on 5 blankets. Thorne saw this as outright extortion. He angrily turned his back to the chief, stalking off towards his quarters. The chief, indignant himself, followed the captain, taunting him for being such a weak bargainer and waving the otter pelts in the air. Incensed, the captain grabbed one of the furs and, according to varying accounts, either struck the chief with it or rubbed it in his face, shouting, "Damn your eyes!" He subsequently threw Newcombe and all of his cohorts off of the Tonquin and sent word from Mackay and Hosea Cowell to return. Mackay was horrified at the captain's pomposity, and the experienced traders in the crew now all believed themselves to be in great danger. They insisted that now was the time for the Tonquin to pull up anchors and to take its, but Captain Thorne would hear none of it. Just after sunrise on the following morning, a singular canoe appeared on the water, pulling up next to the Tonquin. Captain Thorne, as well as much of the rest of the crew, was still asleep. The Tla-o-qui-aht inside the canoe held up furs and made overtures of peace towards the crewmen on watch, who were convinced to let the small ship come aboard. Captain Thorne, as well as Mackay and Hosea Cowell, were summoned to the deck, and trading was commenced. But soon more canoes began to flock to the Tonquin. At first, just a few, but then more, and then more. Again, Mackay and Hosea Cowell beseeched Captain Thorne to only allow a small group of Tla-o-qui-aht on board at a time. Again, Thorne dismissed their concerns wholeheartedly. Hosea Cowell then noticed that many of the Tla-o-qui-aht warriors wore fur mantles draped over their necks and shoulders, a curious wardrobe choice considering the warm June weather. Yet again, the captain roundly condemned the idea of being caught off guard by a surprise attack. Finally, the number of Tla-o-qui-aht on board the Tonquin became unmanageable. And yet still, the canoes continued to pull up next to the Tonquin. Finally, Thorne was forced to order the decks cleared and the topsails unfurled, and the anchor weighed. The mood on board the ship, and that of Thorne in particular, was rapidly devolving from one of joviality to one of panicked suspicion. As the preparations were being made to move, and the Tla-o-qui-aht were being ushered off the Tonquin and back into their canoes, James Lewis, acting as the ship's clerk, had been hunched down next to a bale of blankets, taking stock of inventory. Suddenly, a startling, bone-chilling war cry rang out, piercing the muggy summer air. The Tla-o-qui-aht chief, standing next to Lewis, brandished a large hunting knife, burying it deep into the unfortunate American's back. Lewis fell forward into the ship's companionway, alive but grievously wounded, and a massacre ensued on board the Tonquin. Mackay, standing nearby, was the only crewman who had broken the typical policy which barred anyone from carrying arms above deck without explicit permission, and snuck a pistol into his waistband. With the advent of the attack, Mackay, the seasoned, strong-willed Scotsman, pulled the weapon and made use of its single shot in disposing a lone Tla-o-qui-aht warrior. The other warriors immediately leapt upon Mackay, bludgeoning him mercilessly with the war clubs they had concealed beneath their furs. Mackay was then tossed, barely alive, into a canoe, where he was dispatched by Tla-o-qui-aht women with large oars. Next to fall was Thorne, who in fact fought valiantly and viciously with the pocket-knife he kept on his person as he made a desperate bid to get to the cache of weapons kept on board. He managed to eviscerate 4 of his assailants, though he suffered several grievous wounds in the process. He too was soon felled by a mighty strike from a war club. The bulk of the pitiable crew on board were then cut and clubbed down over the next few minutes as the Tla-o-qui-aht exacted their revenge for the captain's disrespect. Every sailor on the decks was killed, save for the native translator, Tla-o-qui-aht. Also, still alive was James Lewis, who had dragged himself into the shadows and hidden for the remainder of the attack. Now satisfied, the Tla-o-qui-aht took what goods they fancied most and returned to their canoes, rowing across the placid, chilly waters as the imposing Tonquin now sat still with its crew cold in death. However, in a miraculous oversight, the Tla-o-qui-aht had overlooked the 7 sailors who had climbed into the ship's rigging to unfurl the topmast. After the Tla-o-qui-aht made their exit, the sailors made their way to the deck, and then below deck, where they found the dying Lewis. Lewis, resigned to his fate, had told the remaining survivors to cast out in one of the rowboats, and that he would stay behind. He burned for revenge against the Tla-o-qui-aht, and sought to make his last act his retribution. He requested only that he be left with a line of gunpowder stretching from where he lay to the ship's powder magazine, which contained nearly 9,000 pounds of gunpowder. He would wait until they returned the next day, which all assumed to be a certainty, as there was still so much valuable loot left on board. Then he would blow the ship up. This, he hoped, would create time for his cohorts to escape and eliminate as many of their pursuers as possible. After jarring farewells, the men left Lewis alone with his thoughts as they slipped away in the rowboat. And now here he sits, retching in pain and smiling to himself as his ship grows heavier and heavier with the weight of the Tla-o-qui-aht climbing on board. Before long, roughly 200 warriors swarmed the deck and hulls of the once mighty vessel. Now, but a carcass to be scavenged. Perhaps Lewis takes one last look at the brilliant British Columbia sky, or thinks once more of his upstate New York home, or the Hawaiian Islands, the Falklands, the barrooms of New York City, or the beaches of Oahu. Then, as Tla-o-qui-aht watches from the shore, unaware that there are any survivors at all, the Tonquin erupts in what is likely the largest explosion that would be seen in the Pacific Northwest until World War II's battle for the Aleutian Islands. A din of grief and horror erupt from the Tla-o-qui-aht assembled on shore as a giant fireball consumes what is left of the Tonquin within minutes. Not only is this a tragedy for the Tla-o-qui-aht, but the explosion has not served its secondary purpose in providing a distraction for the escaping sailors. According to Tla-o-qui-aht, they are soon blown to shore by a fierce gale and captured. In retribution for the killing of their tribesmen, the sailors are summarily tortured to death. It will be weeks later when word finally reaches Fort Astoria, passed on by reluctant natives who now seem to be inexplicably fleeing the area. Save for Tla-o-qui-aht, who is now a prisoner of the Tla-o-qui-aht, there are no survivors. The entire crew of the Tonquin, as well as the ship itself, have been lost. Word make its way to Oster, who will find himself much aggrieved, but more determined than ever to establish a trading foothold in the territory. But the many tales of Oster's ambitions, as well as those of the plight of the peoples of the Pacific Northwest, who will suffer untold hardships in the years to follow, are, for tonight, other stories for other time. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the Join button, or click the link below in the description to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.